from you, Angela.
All right. I don't know how. Are we recording now? We are recording.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, this is the Brain to Book Cyber Convention Fantasy Panel Discussion number 1. Our topic for today are Elves and Dwarves required for fantasy. Now, this is a tie-in to the blog tour that we did for what elements define fantasy for me. I'm going to go around. I am Timothy Bateson. I am the fantasy genre manager for this year. I've had the pleasure of setting up multiple events over the last few weeks, and we have a lot going on. I am also the author of Under a Hunter's Moon, the Shadows over Seattle prequels #1, and the upcoming novel series that I'm co-writing with my wife, Sandi, who is also joining us on this panel.
Hello.
Sandi, if you go ahead and unmute yourself and say hi.
Hello, my name is Sandi Bateson, the other half of the writing co-authors with my husband, Tim. I write fantasy and urban fantasy, and Angela's flashing the book. I'm actually being published for the very first time in Book Dreams. Very, very new to it. So this is, it's both fantasy and Book Dreams that I wrote. I wrote 2 short stories. Okay.
All right, Anita, you're an old hand at these. Go ahead and say hi.
Hi, I'm Anita Stewart. I write under A.S. Stewart. I currently have a fantasy series. This is the first book, Ghosts of the Sea Moon. And I also write horror, and you can see my horror stuff at the convention too. Anyway, and that's it. I also write poetry too, by the way, and I'm also writing a poem a day this month. So anyway, that's me.
And it's always fascinating following Anita's trail through the various websites and the Facebooks, because she has her own group going, and it's wonderful watching those poems going up every morning. So, Tom, go ahead and say hi.
Hello, Tom Fallwell. I am a fantasy author. I wrote the Dragonblood Throne Legacy, as well as the Rangers of Lorien series, and working on another fantasy novel called Tomasa, and also a science fiction novel. So I'm branching out into a little bit of sci-fi, but still fantasy lover at heart. And I'll be sitting here listening to everybody and speaking when they tell me to speak. So.
I am Angela B. Chrysler, creator of B2BCyCon, Brain to Books, and author of the fantasies Dolor and Shadow, Fire and Lies, Tales of the Drury series. And you can find me at angelabchrysler.com or braintobooks.com.
And I just want to point out to everyone that Angela is actually Miss CyCon herself. Without her, this brainchild of epic proportions just wouldn't have come about or happened at all. So thank you very much for bringing everyone together, Angela. It's an absolute pleasure working with you and the crew. So today's topic, as I said, we are looking at fantasy. Are elves, dwarves, etc. required for fantasy or not? I'm going to open the floor and just very quickly ask everyone, what do you look for in fantasy in terms of races? Can you have fantasy without particular key characteristics like elves, gnomes, trolls, dragons even? I know people have got kind of split about this one. Let's throw that one out to Anita, please.
Well, I think you can, considering I wrote a fantasy book without any trolls, elves, or stuff. There is one kind of dragon at the end, but but yeah, I think I've read a lot of fantasy books that don't have what you consider traditional races in them, and they're very good.
Angela, I know you are under 2 books so far for your own fantasy series. What's your feeling on the matter?
I have elves and dwarves, trolls and giants in my fantasies. I really, Anita, what book did you write that you have no?
Well, I mean, I've got a few in Ghosts of the Sea Moon. I mean, because I mean, you do have a few sea monsters and you've got gods, but I mean, there's no traditional stuff in it, really, like the elves and the dwarves and things.
I'm trying to imagine. I looked up the definition of high fantasy versus low fantasy. High fantasy, also known as epic fantasy, states that the world takes place in a different world, different universe completely. The examples they gave were Lord of the Rings. Your standard the land where it takes place is fictitious, Middle Earth. That was pretty much it. It had to be of fantastical proportions. There was a journey that took place, but primarily there was a magic system in a different world that was not Earth. Earth was completely not mentioned here. That is high fantasy.
Yeah,
the race is not mentioned. Low fantasy is when the fantastical world filled with magic either crosses over or comes into this world, like Harry Potter. Harry Potter, there's Earth, and then they can go to the magical world Hogwarts. And Narnia is the other world where they're at Earth, they cross into a portal into a magical different world, so they're parallel. But Earth is referenced in the low fantasy. No mention in the definition is made of the races, but my argument is, can you be in a parallel universe, or I'm sorry, in high fantasy, can you be in a foreign universe and not have races that aren't humanoid? Tom?
It looks like, yeah.
I'm working on a book right now. I'm co-authoring with Aaron Michael Hall. It's called Temesa. It's not going to be ready for another month or two, but it's in another world. As a matter of fact, this world is like a high mesa surrounded by clouds. There's no sea. There's no ships. And there's only one race. They're humans. But there's fantastic creatures, no dragons, giant birds, big warriors, just there's magic system, but it's just really not your traditional high fantasy, yet by the definition that Angela read, it would fit a high fantasy profile because it is a different world. So I think fantasy can be anything that an author really wants it to be. And it can be, there are just so many possibilities, it's endless. Especially with fantasy. Science fiction, you're limited by the science. But fantasy, you have no limits.
What's your feeling on the matter, Sandy? Go ahead and unmute yourself and give.
Well, I think that Angela is right with the high fantasy and the low fantasy. The short story that I wrote, the very, very short story that I wrote for Book Dreams, how writer's block came to be, and basically there are no dwarves or elves or anything like that. There's a witch that curses the guy, and basically all authors from henceforth are under the curse. I also do have a fantasy series that does have elves and dwarves and trolls and dragons and such. So I kind of seesaw back and forth between the two, I think. But then there's also the Jim Butcher series that Tim and I have both read. I'm trying to remember the name of the series. Tim, help me out.
That would be the Cauldron series.
The Cauldron series, yeah. Where there are no trolls and elves and gnomes and things like that, but it is another world full of magic. So that's my viewpoint on it.
So with that in mind, we obviously seem to have the definitions here that high fantasy doesn't have to require fantastical creatures, but at least has to take place in another world with elements of the fantastic, whether that's big, gigantic creatures like Tom was talking about, or magic systems of some kind or another. I would argue that the Narnia series isn't necessarily a low fantasy system, because you've got all the magic that's floating around and it is a different world. But are we talking about this being a metaphysical different world like it is in Harry Potter, where the whole concept is that realistically you're looking at an echo of our existing reality? Tom?
I don't know. I think having a different world isn't so much. I mean, you can take a different time period of Earth and turn it into a fantasy. If anyone's read the Conan novels, Robert E. Howard, it was actually Earth, but it was way in the past before recorded history. And yet it was still considered kind of high fantasy. There was no elves or dwarves, but there was plenty of magic. And Conan, the barbarian. But I mean, that's, for me, that was one of the series of novels that really got me drawn into fantasy as a whole. So I think it's the world is not so much to me, high fantasy is you've got a lot of magic, or you've got a strong magic system. Like Angela said, it's set in not necessarily another world, but in a world or a period of time where magic was prolific, so to speak. So it just, I think that to me is the definition, but I mean, I'm sure this can be debated from now till doomsday.
Yeah, I have a feeling Anita's probably got her own take on that one.
Yeah, well, I was just saying, like he was saying, the Conan. I mean, that, yeah, it's high fantasy, but it's also the subgenre of sword and sorcery, which is in itself its own little genre. Because I mean, you've got like now when you've got very much not races, and you've got more sword play and more magic, and so that would be one of the fantasy subgenres that really you don't need the elves or the dwarves and stuff like that. And actually so I mean, there's different types of fantasy that have different rules too. So if you're talking just the classic fantasy like the Tolkien and Narnia and whatnot, yeah, that sort of needs the elves and the dwarves and whatnot, because that's what people expect. But if you're talking low fantasy, sword and sorcery, even paranormal fantasy, you don't need the races.
Would you agree with that, Sandy?
I would have to say, yeah. I was going to make a point. How I got into fantasy writing, well, obviously I read the Xanth novels by Piers Anthony. He was a lot of my inspiration, as well as Terry Pratchett for my books. And as a child, reading about Ponce de Leon in school, I was like, okay, so this is a guy that was real. He went to Florida to look for the Fountain of Youth, which never existed. But it sounds like fantasy, actually. It really does. It sounds like a fantasy story, but it actually happened. And he was, a lot of his men were slaughtered by the Calusa Native Americans. I will not say Indians. And he was mortally wounded by the Calusas. And it struck me as I could take this and turn it into a fantasy where the place where we have the elves and gnomes and dragons and such can cross over into our world, because back in Ponce's time, they still had the stuff about dragons and such in the mythology. So that's my take on it.
All right, so basically we seem to have an agreement. Really, it looks like that people are talking about the necessity for magical creatures or magic systems really depends on the subgenre. I think, Anita, you mentioned that we got the sword and sorcery subgenre. What other subgenres do you think there are out there in particular? I mean, I look at sword and sorcery, I look at the high magic systems like the Calderon series from Jim Butcher, and I know that there are others out there. I think, Anita, you've probably got a different take, and I know Tom definitely has.
Well, yeah, there's lots of subgenres of fantasy, and they keep popping up with new ones every day. But I mean, like urban fantasy, for instance, I mean, that in a lot of ways, it does depend on creatures. Because that one, I think more of, except maybe the classic stuff, like the Tolkien stuff, depends. Because, I mean, that one has vampires, werewolves, witches, and all these underground magic systems. So I think with that one, you really do need, I mean, you've got urban fantasy even with elves, I think, these days. So you really need creatures in that one. When you're doing, but when you're doing high fantasy, it depends on the world too. Like if you're doing a world based on mythology, for instance, you're going to have the elves, you're going to have the dwarves, you're going to have whatever. But if you're creating your own world, like I did, you can put anything you want in it. So you can make up new creatures.
Okay, so here's a question for you, Anita. You mentioned the subgenre being urban fantasy. I always considered that a genre on its own. Harry Potter, high magic systems and everything like that, would you consider it fantasy or urban fantasy?
That one's actually fantasy because, well, at least to me, because I mean, I think if you're going to be urban fantasy, you really have to take place in a city. And some of Harry Potter did take place in London, but I mean, the majority of it was in Hogwarts. So to me, that's more low fantasy than urban.
So, okay, Tom, I know you've probably got your ideas on the subgenres. Go ahead, give me your take.
Well, one thing, I don't think of high fantasy and epic fantasy as the same thing. I don't think of epic fantasy so much as a genre as much as some kind of style of fantasy. I think a fantasy can be epic and not be high fantasy. But other than that, I tend to agree with everything that's kind of been said. I mean, my own Rangers of Lorien trilogy, I put it in, it's another world, it's got magic. It's got dwarves and elves, but I don't call them dwarves and elves. I call them Dralder and Varda. So the name is different, but the Varda got pointed ears, the Dralder have beards, and so in that sense, you could say it's high fantasy, but I consider that series more of an epic fantasy because of the scope that it covers. And that's where I differentiate epic, meaning that it's large in scope, either covering a long period of time or covering a vast system. There's just something epic about it, not necessarily just because it's got elves and dwarves does that make it epic.
So basically, you're looking at a matter of scale. So basically, you're looking at something that's larger than life.
Yes. I mean, in that sense, Conan was epic to me because, at least when I was reading it, he was larger than life, But like my Rangers of Lorien series, I cover, it's just a story that encompasses a couple of years. But in those couple of years, they're revealing things that happened hundreds of years in the past. So we're like, the story takes place in the fourth era, and I talk about things that happened in the first, second, and third era. And it just covers such a grand scale because there's a bad god trying to destroy everything, and the Rangers are trying to save everything. So it becomes an epic in that sense to me. Whereas my Dragonblood Throne Legacy, I don't consider that epic. I consider it more of a high fantasy because it does have elves. It don't have dwarves, but it's not as grand in scale as the Rangers books were.
So, Sandy, I know you've got the an Elfish Quest, the Elfton Chronicles series you're working on. How would you qualify those? Because you've got elements that cross into our world at the very start, and then it's really pretty much in the realms itself. Would you consider those low fantasy, or would you consider those high fantasy with possibly shades of epic?
I would have to say low fantasy with shades of epic, because I do have the Game of the Gods in there, where like the first book in the series, it's a battle of between the two thunder gods. And I'm crossing mythology here too, because the two thunder gods is Thor and Zeus. Each book is a Game of the Gods played out. And the second book that I'm working on, my main character from the first book, who is human, she gets to go and play against Thor to try and find her daughter, who is back in the time of Ponce de Leon. So I would say it's low fantasy with shades of epic fantasy in it.
Okay, I had a problem with my unmute there for a moment. Okay, so let's pick a subgenre, and can you give me something that actually typifies it? I know, Tom, you mentioned the Conan series, you said is epic. Harry Potter, we said, was more low fantasy. Let's go. Okay, yeah, let's go with this. Let's high fantasy. Give me one genre, one series or one book that really typifies it for you.
Well, for me, the typical high fantasy, what I would judge high fantasy is Tolkien. I mean, the Lord of the Rings, to me, that's high fantasy. It's got shades of epic and all, and you know, I mean, you can have a blend of so many different things in one, but to me, the Lord of the Rings typifies what I would call high fantasy. That might just be my opinion, but that's the way it feels to me.
Yeah, I agree with that one. Lord of the Rings is high fantasy. I mean, it's the classic high fantasy, really.
Yeah, so basically, I know a lot of people use Tolkien as the standard at which they set fantasy. And I find that very interesting, considering in places how difficult it is to read. But for me, I'm gonna go with I'm gonna be honest. I'm gonna go with the Earthsea trilogy for me, because it's a little bit more down to earth, but it has such a well constructed magic system in it. It's not as free and open as the way Lord of the Rings was constructed in that respect. I'm thinking Sandy's probably got her own take.
I would have to say Tolkien is high fantasy, definitely. It is another world. Yeah. I would have to agree that it is high fantasy. Piers Anthony's Xanth novels. It is supposed to be based on another world. However, it looks like the shape of Florida. But you do have total magic there. Everybody has talent, one talent per person. So I always considered that high fantasy.
I hadn't read all of the Xanth novels, but I agree, those are great.
All right then. So we've covered the high fantasy. I know epic fantasy really is just a matter of taste, I think, on how you qualify that. I don't necessarily think it's a subgenre in its own right. Personally, Tom, I know you think Conan books are great in that respect. Anita, I know you've probably got a take on.
I didn't hear the last part of what you said. You were muted.
Oh, I don't know how that happened.
I heard you probably have a take on, and then nothing after that.
That.
Yeah, well, to me, epic fantasy and high fantasy are kind of interchangeable to me. It really doesn't matter what you call it to me, whether you call it high fantasy or epic fantasy, as long as it's in another world and it's got lots of stuff going on.
So, okay, so I think we're pretty much covering the genres side of things there. In terms of the elements of fantasy, would you prefer to see a well-defined magic system which operates by rules, or would you prefer to see something that has a little bit more flexibility and basically has a loose and ready and free feel about it?
I think I prefer rules. I mean, they don't have to be strict rules, and they don't have to be a lot of rules, but I think you need structure in fantasy. Otherwise, it gets like, why did they do that? You know, they didn't do that in the first book, or especially if you're doing a series. And it can get confusing if you don't have structure, in my opinion.
I see Sandy's nodding over there. Go ahead and give us your take, Sandy.
I'd have to agree with Anita. It has to have structure to it. In my fantasy series, there are rules to the magic. A human can't cross over into the realms and suddenly begin to do magic. They have to have elfin blood for one part. Tama, my main character, she is human, but she does have elfin blood originally. Her grandfather was full-blooded elf, so she's able to start doing magic, you know, and it kind of shocks her, you know, but there are rules to it, and she's learning through dreams to do her magic. Yeah, I'd have to say there has to be structure to it.
What about you, Tom? I know you've probably got an interesting version on this one.
Well, I tend to agree, and in most cases that can be true, but it depends on the story being told. I can imagine a story where magic is something maybe just brief that happens without an explanation. But you can't let magic become something that draws the reader away from what's really going on, what the story is. So if you've got somebody using magic and they just seem all powerful and there's no explanation or any kind of limitation, you can leave the reader guessing. So it depends on, I think, the story being told, but in most cases I would agree with what they're talking about. There needs to be some kind of structure. There needs to be limitations. You can't just have some all-powerful godlike being running around doing whatever they want and and nobody understanding how the heck are they doing that. So
yeah, so basically you're looking at magic as being like a character in its own right in that respect. Sandy, I know, has a very interesting character, Phonesby, and it actually brings us back, Tom, to what you were saying about magic being kind of wild and doing whatever it wants. Sandy, tell us a little bit more about Phonesby, because I think this is an interesting idea.
Well, Phonesby, basically, he suppresses his magic and refuses to do his magic, and it kind of leaks out of him regardless, because he's suppressing it. So he's got a very overactive imagination, so whatever he's thinking of at the time basically comes to reality for about an hour or so. So, like, okay, at the beginning of the story that I started for Phonesby, he's sitting at a campfire and he's thinking about dinner, and he's like, turnips would be nice. Suddenly he became a turnip with green teal leaves, and he was paisley colored. And he's like, well, if one must be a turnip, I guess, you know, this color is fine. And then he spies something nearby, and he's like, hello, what's that? It's his mule, thinking that here's dinner. And he's like, shoo, shoo, with his teal green leaves, and the mule approaches him, and he's like, he knows he won't die. He always bumbles his way out of everything. Bumble echoes in his mind, and he suddenly becomes a bubbly bee. And he stings his mule and says, that'll teach you for trying to eat me. And then he realizes that once a bee stings someone, they usually die. And he's like, oh, crap. Well, for the next hour, he spent his time as a pile of, well, you get the idea.
So I just wanted to use that as an example, because in that particular respect, it's a very wild magic system that he's actually got access to. Because of his personality, it goes completely and utterly crazy. So I wanted to just have Sandy go through that, because I like the idea of having rules, but sometimes the rule is basically expect the unexpected. So give me your thoughts on that one, because wild magic is something that's not very often done in fantasy books that I've actually come across.
Well, I think wild magic is fine, as long as you've got consequences to go with. Oh, sorry.
that's all right. Go ahead.
As long as you have consequences to go with it, you know? Because, I mean, if you just have things going off and then doing whatever it wants and you go on to the next thing, it's sort of like, what's the point? But if you have the wild magic and you have, like in the example, I mean, he ends up as what he ends up as. I mean, there are consequences, and you can get situations and action and whatnot out of it. So, I mean, yeah, as long as it feeds the story, I think it's great.
Yeah, that's what I was saying earlier. It depends on the story, and that was a good example. When she was talking about all that, what came to my mind is a character from the movie. I can't even remember it now. But every time he tried to cast a spell on somebody, it'd backfire, and he tried to turn someone into a puppy, and he became the puppy, and so on, or a goose, and it's just. That was a kind of a wild magic, and you didn't know where it was going to go. He had all this power, but he really didn't know how to be able to utilize it, and it kind of went where it wanted to. But then again, that was part of the story. So
I'm getting shades of Willow on this one. If you remember how it all handled with Bath Morda being shifted into multiple shapes. Was it Bath Morda? Or was the other one? I can't remember, the good sorceress, who'd been stuck in another form for so long. But so yeah, that was kind of actually a very interesting way of doing the wilder side of magic. but there were rules and consequences. I think I definitely have to agree with Anita on that one. No matter how you handle magic as a presence in the world, there has to be some kind of strictures to it. Not necessarily structure, but certainly a definite limitation and consequence of what happens. Because otherwise you've got no way of shaping the forward movement of stories. Now, in terms of moving stories forward, one of the things I know someone was asking earlier on one of the other chats was, in terms of social or political systems, do you think they should also be part of the story, or do you think that's something that really should be left out in terms of fantasy? Is it a really big thing for you as a reader, or as a
I didn't want to jump in again if I again, I think it depends on the story that's being told, if it's relevant, or if it offers something to the reader. One of the things with my Rangers books, before I even sat down and actually, I had an idea for a story, but that was it. But before I even started that, I said, I want a believable world to back this up, something with politics, economics, and all of that. And all of that does come into play through the story in certain places. But you could have told the story without it. But I think that adds something that the reader can relate to in such a way that it makes the story more alive for them. The characters have something to play off of, not just being out there all by themselves. So I think it depends on the story, on what's being told, but I think having those kind of systems in the background help make the story more real for the reader.
Yeah, I agree with that. And in some cases, the story actually needs the politics, because if you're doing a fantasy that has monarchy and kings and king's guards or whatever, it's like I'm writing one now, Prophecy of Seven, where the political structure is actually the motivation for a lot of the characters, because most of them are rebels, and they're trying to, because the system they're under conquered them years ago, and then they're trying to overthrow the king and various other things. So I mean, in cases like those types of books, the political system becomes very important. And even with my current series, Saga of the Outer Islands, in the second book, the Navy politics starts interfering with the main character and his quest. So, I mean, in some cases, politics are actually necessary to the story.
I heard this question and I can't get away from it. I'm like, when I started doing my writing with Dolor and Shadow, Fire and Lies, I wanted more than ever to recreate a sense of realism to the story. I wanted people to feel like a very historical feature, like it wasn't just a fantasy book with a glaze over it. I wanted them to feel like this was a real living, breathing world. So my book takes place in Norway in 995 CE, Norway. It was a very specific time period for a very specific reason, but it's told through the elves' point of view, so it actually looks like it's not Norway at all. One of the first things I asked myself to recreate that realism is, let's fast forward 1,000 years from today. What will people, if somebody 1,000 years ago from today wanted to research or write a book about right now, what would they know? And the first thing that hit me was a newspaper. They would pick up a newspaper. In fact, if you were to try and research anything from 200-300 years ago, what we know comes from their newspapers. In 1912, for instance, you would read about the ship of the Titanic. You read about women's rights to vote. You would read about the publication of The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Leroux. There is something about newspapers that do a nice summary of, hey, this is what this world is. And through those newspapers, you're able to recreate a culture, and this right here is it, a culture, a race, a people, a belief, a religion. Politics feeds a culture and the setting of a book. And it could be political sciences, it could be governmental politics, it could be art politics. It is the heart and the breath of a setting, of a city. And I sat down and wrote up a newspaper. I recommend you do this if you are writing anything historical. Write a newspaper reflecting of your time period. Think about wars happening. Think about, and that was it right there. I thought about what was invented, what food was new, what drinks were new, and what was coming in and out of the trade routes, and who was king, what wars were happening. That's all politics. And suddenly I had a war going on in the middle of my setting. That's something you can't ignore. One of my favorite things that came out was apparently 995 CE was around the decade that hops came into existence to make beer. So this was the moment where people started to discover hops, and suddenly they got away from Groot and started to drink the beers that we know of today. Can you imagine being alive for that political debate? Which is better? And I actually worked that into my story, where I've got these two men arguing over which of their beer is better, whether it's made with Groot or whether it's made with hops. I looked into trade routes. It became so impacting on my characters, on my story, that it suddenly became a very real, breathing world. So for me, yes, absolutely. Politics is where story creativity begins, because suddenly you're watching your characters bounce off of all that information. Do they care? Do they want to care? Are they forced to get involved? Are they doing everything they can to avoid it? You're muted, Tim.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting way of looking at it. I hadn't actually thought about it from that point of view, because normally I'm dealing with a more modern setting when I write, because I'm dealing mostly with urban fantasy. But when I wrote my science fiction, Evelyn Transcendent, the politics was definitely at the core of the story, even though it didn't really make much of an appearance. It was the whole driving force behind the start of the story. And I'm actually in the process now of going back and revising that and making that more of an interesting part of the plot line, because it has to be there for us to understand why everything happened. So yeah, I'd have to agree with you, Angela, and it's definitely a big part of any story, in terms of as a driving force, even if it's just on a lower level scale, like the family politics of who agrees with what, who's doing what to who, as I always look at it.
Yeah. And one of the other things I love looking at this as an example is Sound of Music. It's not about the Nazis. It's not about World War II. You are just watching this family interact with the war happening around them. But in the second act, you start to see how that war is pushing more and more into their ideals and dreams, and how they're forced to react to it.
Yeah. So here's what I'm going to ask here on. Does anyone have a question that they think we should be looking at right now? Because I'm kind of running out of ideas.
I have a question. What do you mean by that? But what do you mean? You're muted. You were talking again, weren't you?
I was not. No talking. Well, we've covered what we think of as genre staples, in terms of, the subgenres. We've talked about epic, high, low fantasy. We've talked about where it crosses over into urban, and from there We looked at some of the topics we covered in terms of our preferred books or series for those genres. Then we've obviously talked about whether or not we actually need certain characters to make that work. And in Tom's case, just renaming them, and I know in Angela's case, renaming particular racial groups to better fit the storyline and the time period, or at least the cultures of the time. But does anyone think we haven't covered a topic in terms of what the staples of fantasy really are?
I do have a question.
Required for a fantasy story. Okay.
Do you think, imagine Star Wars for just a moment without any of the non-humanoid alien races. Jabba the Hutt would be a man. The androids would be men servants or human servants instead of droids. Take out every non-humanoid, like everyone, just make them all human. Would the story be credible? Would you believe that you are now in a galaxy far, far away? Sorry, wrong franchise. But would you believe it? Is it now suspending the reality that you're on Tatooine versus Alderaan? Would you believe it?
I'll counter that with a different question. Here's the question I would ask, because I've always thought of Star Wars more as a fantasy than a sci-fi because of the way the elements that are involved in the storytelling.
Mm-hmm. And it is,
to me, Star Wars could easily be taken and put, instead of on starships and different planets, on ships, regular ships, and different continents or countries.
Okay. Yeah.
Fantasy character with fantasy creatures instead of the alien creatures, but without changing the heart of the story.
Well, right, but that's bringing up the topic, is this about the story? And we're not talking about the story. We're talking about the setting. You want to claim that Star Wars takes place in a galaxy far, far away. In this location, in this foreign location, okay, I'll believe that. But if I don't see if I don't see the Wookiees, am I going to believe that this is supposed to take place in this completely different galaxy?
I think Tom has a take on that. I saw him raise his hand over there.
I don't think aliens are necessary. I mean, again, it depends on the story, on what the author's trying to portray. And in the case of something like Star Wars, George Lucas was trying to show a diverse group of cultures within the galaxy, the different species. I mentioned when we started that I'm writing my first science fiction novel. Well, there's no aliens in it. They're all humans, every last one of them.
Can I try a different example?
Okay.
The movie Valerian. Has anyone here not seen it?
I've seen it.
Okay. Valerian is called Valerian, the city of 1,000 planets. And basically the setting, they arrive in Valerian, and there are over 1,000 cultures mingling in this city. Would you believe that they are in a city of 1,000 planets if you did not see 1,000 different species and cultures? If they were all humanoid, would you believe that that was the city of 1,000 planets?
Go ahead, Anita.
No, in that situation, no. And maybe not for Star Wars either. But like we were saying earlier, it depends on the story, because if you watch something like The Expanse, which is great sci-fi, there's no aliens in that, but it's some of the best sci-fi on TV at the moment. So I think it really depends on the story. Like if you're, like you said, if it's in a galaxy far, far away, or if it involves other planets, then yeah, aliens might be necessary. If you're just doing a sci-fi about human colonization, no, they're not necessary. And it's the same with fantasy. It depends on the story.
Yeah, so my take on this one, I would, if you do not somehow differentiate the various cultures, I would have a problem with it, yes. But I'm watching. I watched Black Panther. I'm going to use this as my example. It's set in Wakanda.
Mm-hmm.
There are different tribes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yes, it's a smaller number that you're talking about the 1,000 worlds and everything, but you could clearly visually see the differences between the tribes just in the way they dressed, the weapon styles they used, their fighting styles, and everything like that. So yes,
Yeah.
I think you could take those stories and remove the alien or racial aspects of them and portray them in terms of the cultural and culture, fashion, fighting styles, weapon styles, and things like that, without losing the heart of the story.
That does
And that's
make
one of the
sense.
reasons why that's one of the reasons why I think Star Wars could still be done, or could have been done as a fantasy story as opposed to a sci-fi story. I think George Lucas was actually very clever in the way he did it as a sci-fi instead. And I'll be honest with that one. I don't necessarily think that would have worked so well had he tried to do it as a fantasy. But I could have seen the story done as a fantasy with different different elements in different countries or cultures.
The other example I can give is Men in Black. They are supposed to have a massive a center that like a terminal, like an airplane terminal, where people come in, aliens come in, they do a check-in, they turn in their stuff, and then they check out and enter the real world. And in this case, that I do see now it depends on the story. In the case of Men in Black, it is dependent upon the story. You have to see the aliens to believe that that is an alien check-in system, an alien terminal. I think that's what you're trying to say.
Okay. I think so in some respects. But here's what I'd look at. Look at the immigration. Men in Black, you have what is effectively an immigration terminal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now take that historically and look at Liberty Island, the history through Liberty Island,
Yeah.
and all the immigration into the US.
Ellis Island. Yeah.
Ellis Island. Thank you. Could it have been done? Could Men in Black have been done using the different styles and cultures coming through an Ellis Island-like situation? I think so, because you've got these different looks to the people coming in. Their dress styles are different. Their personalities are different because of the cultures they were raised in. I don't know in Men in Black it would have been successful, but that's very much, I think, the feel they were. I think that's very much the feel they were going for.
I guess that's the real question then: is do you need a variety of race to amplify or emphasize the grandeur of a world?
I'm going to say yes.
Oh, you just muted.
And then I'm going to throw the floor. Yeah, I'm going to say yes, and then I'm going to throw the floor open to everyone else, starting with Sandy. Who just went mute at me, so apparently she's not ready to answer that question. Do you need to have the variety to emphasize things?
Yes, I'd say yes. A variety of cultures, at least. Because, I mean, if you just have one culture and it's kind of bland, I think you really need a contrast to have a fully realized world.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I agree. And you've given me some great ideas for the science fiction story I'm writing now. So I got to go back and make a few changes.
Oh, you guys gave me an idea earlier, and I'm sitting here like typing it in, scribbling, like I'm brainstorming. I'm like, oh, I got a great idea. So thank you. Sandy, can you
that's
talk
one of the
yet?
reasons I love doing these, Pat.
Did you say something to me?
No, I think we were looking for Sandy, see if Sandy had a take on that. Do we need the variety of races or cultures?
I would say yes and no. It depends on what you're writing. Like with our urban fantasy, we only have like the werewolves, vampires, wizards in our series. So, it's not a huge variety of culture, but there is,
Yeah.
differences in each of the cultures, how they approach things.
I'm thinking of it on a smaller scale, and I love this. I was thinking about this a couple days ago. I'm in New York. I live 30 minutes from Pennsylvania, 3 hours from Canada. I see Canadian license plates. We see a lot of Canadians over here. We see a lot of Quebec, French speakers. We see a lot of Hispanic, and we see a lot of Oriental who are going to the university. Now, I've been down in Florida. In Florida, I saw a lot of Louisiana plates. I heard a lot of Spanish, a lot of Hispanic speakers, a lot of Jamaican. I have never in my life seen a Jamaican here. I've also been at JFK Airport. I've seen everything. You go to JFK Airport and you will see everything. So it's interesting because setting, area, shows you exactly what you are dealing with as far as a small community goes, what you're close to. Pennsylvania, New York plates where I am, they're everywhere. They're literally for every New York plate, there's going to be a Pennsylvania plate, even though I'm in New York State. But you get down to the city and you're going to see Jersey. You're going to see a lot of Jersey. And it's really fascinating. And I think that's really it. If you want to emphasize a large world, bring more in, bring more race in. If you want to make that world even bigger, it's got to get bigger. You've got to see more variety. It's like a Doctor Who episode, A Rings of Akatan, when they are at the festival with like 8,000 species from neighboring planets. I don't think there was one alien that looked alike. But it was to emphasize this is a huge event with all the neighboring planets, each planet having their own 800 cities, and it was such a massive event that they all came together at this one location for the event. If you want to emphasize that grandeur, it's going to require a lot of different species, races, etc.
Yeah, and I actually think that's a great point, and I think that comes back again to our original concept of whether or not you needed all those. And like you're saying, Angela, I really think it does come down to a matter of scale and scope, how epic you want everything to appear in terms of how it affects the world around you. If you're not doing a big story that's going to affect the whole world, but it's just going to affect a small portion of it, like an individual family or a small community, then definitely you don't need that scope. But if it's going to be something that's going to be world-changing potentially, you definitely epic. You have to do it.
Yeah.
I don't think you have a choice, and I think that's something that's definitely come out from what everyone's been discussing here. Is there anything else we didn't cover?
Now I have the question.
Open.
Now I have the question: if epic fantasy, does that now refer to the journey, the story? This is a large journey of magnitude, or does it mean we're talking about a really large epic-sized world? If it's an epic-sized world, yes, I would say dwarves, elves, and giants are mandatory in the story. And if it's just an epic journey, then no, I don't see where you could keep it small if they're making an epic journey within a small area.
Okay, so epic journey. So we're going back. I'll go back to Lord of the Rings. Could the story of Lord of the Rings have been done with Frodo's journey, with the story of to destroy the ring? Could it have been done without those extra races and everything?
No.
Could it have been? Could we have shown less of a scope?
No, and I will tell you why. Because it all starts with 13 dwarves who were superstitious and felt they needed a 14th person that was not a dwarf so they wouldn't have bad luck on their journey. If dwarves did not exist, superstitious dwarves, then none of it would have taken place at all.
I saw Tom raise his hand.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I know he's going to take.
Well, I agree. I mean, as far as that particular story couldn't be done. But I have read what I would call epic fantasy without, it wasn't like dwarves or elves, but there were different races in the fact they looked the same, maybe some hair coloring and skin coloring different, but they had totally different cultures. So it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, that there has to be that clash of cultures, I think, in something that's epic, if you're talking about the size of the world and the scope of everything. If you're just talking again about story, that depends on what the story is and everything. But I don't think it has to be dwarves and elves.
No, I don't think it has to be dwarves and elves. I think it can be any generic. But there's so much fun to write about.
Not everybody thinks so.
I can't even say that because the dwarves in my book aren't dwarves. They're just a variation of an elf. Sandy? You're muted, hon. There you go.
The thing with Lord of the Rings, though, they really could have saved them so much time if they had used the eagles to get there in the first place.
Did you see there is a YouTube video how Lord of the Rings should have ended? And it shows Gandalf giving the ring to Frodo right after Bilbo's birthday party. Frodo gets on the eagles. The eagles fly them over Mordor. He drops the ring over. That is it. It was Lord of the Rings in 2 minutes.
You're making me think of a video I saw about where he says, one does not simply walk into Mordor.
Oh, yeah.
And I got this whole bit. Yeah, you do. You really do.
What does that fly? You fly into Mordor.
Okay. I'm going to counter that. Okay, if you flew in on an eagle, why couldn't they just shot the eagle down?
Because they wouldn't have seen it coming.
Why not? Are eagles invisible? I mean, as far as I know, those eagles can go down.
They are invisible if they're wearing the one ring.
But then wouldn't the eagle be evil and give the one ring to Sauron?
No, because they are not like man and dwarf, and they are not selfish and materialistic.
So then why do you need Frodo at all?
You don't.
So Gandalf should have just given the ring to the eagle.
That's it.
Okay.
Put it on its little tail end.
I just want to hear Tolkien's opinion on all this.
Would the ring have fit the eagle?
No, but
They could have put it around his neck, baby.
One claw.
yeah, exactly.
Round a claw.
A talon? Do you have any idea how big their talons are? What I like.
Having handled eagles, yes, I have.
And if they shoot down the eagle, there's a chance they would have fallen into Mordor. Problem solved.
Yeah, that depends on where they shot them down, though. I mean, if I was Sauron and I had my forces, I'd have shot the eagles down long before they got to the volcano. I mean the tactical efficiency in the Lord of the Rings is not good. I mean, really.
By the way, the ring adjusts its size to fit the wearer.
That's right.
Oh, that's right. Yes.
That is
Okay.
right. Yeah. What if they have really large, fat fingers?
Got a really large ring.
Do you think they'd be able to do you think it just goes on? That is one thing that I wish they had done in the movie. And I think we are really off topic now, but the ring itself was a character in the book. The ring itself was a character. And they tried. I was the moron who watched all 72 hours of the making of Lord of the Rings per movie. I know things about Lord of the Rings I wish I didn't know. That being said, he did try to give the character to the ring, but it just did not come off, and that was something he was not happy with.
They just mentioned it. They didn't really, the ring didn't have any part.
Whenever you zoom in on the ring and the ring talks, that's supposed to be the character's ring, but it came off instead as Sauron using the ring to communicate, and that's not what it was. The ring was its own character. The ring wants to be found. That was it. Absolutely. The ring was an asshole.
At least we didn't have to sit through the entire multiple pages of Bilbo's birthday party.
No. The Council of Elrond. 50 pages of the Council of Elrond. And I love that in the Council of Elrond, you read The Hobbit. That's what I loved. If you actually sit down and read that chapter in The Lord of the Rings, there's an entire section there that just tells you everything that happened in The Hobbit. So it's like, I just read this book. Why am I reading it again? Oh.
I think that became a big sticking point for me too. Tolkien is held up as the example of fantasy and great fantasy writing.
So here's your question for your next topic. Go ahead with your butt.
But you have to get through the slog, the back history, the flashbacks.
Yes.
All the stuff like Sandy's just fallen asleep even thinking about the Council of Elrond.
The songs. Oh my God. The thousands of songs in his books.
Yeah.
That's
you've got the culture, but it's too much on display in my opinion.
Yeah. And he was not a good songwriter. Not at all. When they rewrote the scripts, they had to really reword a lot of the songs because he could not write poetry. Oh God.
Regardless of all that, he's still a big inspiration for me.
Yeah.
And I still love The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, and I just love them.
Oh, I love The Silmarillion. Oh, I love it. It's my favorite. It really is. Now,
Silmarillion, Tolkien short stories.
I have to know. This is a legitimate question here, peoples. If you've read Lord of the Rings, did any of you actually read every single one of his songs, or did you skip them? I skipped them. I skipped them.
I read them.
You read every one of them?
It's been a long time ago, but yes, I did.
I gave it a good haul. How did you do? I got through half the book. I think I was through Two Towers when I just said I can't do any more of these songs. So I would read like the first 2 paragraphs and then I'd skip the songs. How did you do, Tim, with those? Did you bother with any of them? Did you get through like book 1 of his songs?
I think I skimmed them more than anything else.
You skimmed them, okay. Yeah, I remember this one. There were a few of them like this where it was just pages. I think it was 4 pages of one of his songs. And I'm just like, next. Oh, those songs.
I would have to admit that I have never been able to get through any of the books because I fall asleep every single time.
Not even The Hobbit?
The Hobbit. Okay, they go here. They camp. They tell stories. They go here. They camp. They tell stories. They go to a pub. They tell stories. They go here. They tell stories. I'm like, get on with the action.
But that is fantasy.
Let me add too that it might depend upon your age. When I read Lord of the Rings, there wasn't a whole lot of other stuff out there.
No, you had 2 options. You had The Ring of Arboros and Tolkien.
I do have to admit, I do like the idea of an inanimate object having a personality.
I love that. Yeah.
Yeah. In my fantasy series, Unelfish Quest, I've got a crystal, but that big, blue, free thinking, has a male voice that comes out of it, and it can think to you telepathically, and it can read the minds of other creatures around it. Well, my main character asked it, do you have a name? And he says, no, you can name me if you want. And she says, I think I'll call you Billy. And he says, I know there's a joke in there somewhere, but who's this Billy Crystal?
That's so bad. That is so bad, Sandy. Now, you were talking, and I started to play out the script in my head. So what I heard is, so what should I call you? John. It's just this really deep, just call me John or Steve. Really anticlimactic, not a, what is it? Keith. Call me Keith.
I have to admit, I am a Billy Crystal fan.
That's okay. We'll forgive you.
Xanth was full of puns.
Who is? I'm sorry?
Xanth, the series Xanth was full of puns. My favorite was the cat-ass trophy, the catastrophe.
That is awesome. The catastrophe.
Yes, as I said, Pierce Anthony was a big inspiration. When you guys read Book Dreams too, the spectacle, how eyeglasses came to be in the realms. Do not hit me over the puns, please.
Now, I do have a question that you brought up there, Tim. You said, and we've all said at one point, that Tolkien is the archetype. So my question, this would be a really awesome panel discussion later on the subject of Tolkien. Do you think that that's good? Do you think that it's bad that he is the archetype? Do you think that he has set us up with a wrong type of archetype? Do you think that it was out of sheer desperation because we had nothing else? Is it sacrilege to call Tolkien the archetype today? And saying all of this, I'm going to quote something that Peter, I cannot remember the director of Lord of the Rings, that Peter said was, I'm sorry?
Peter Jackson.
Jackson, thank you. I'm going to quote something Peter Jackson said about Tolkien. Tolkien could not write. He couldn't. And he took out the book, this is again during the making of, and he broke down everything that Tolkien did wrong with his writing. And oh my God, the man cannot write. He had a great story, but he couldn't write. It was terrible. There were so many basic flaws that if we were to do them today, we would not get published unless we went self-published. The only reason why Tolkien was published is because he was friends with a publisher. He couldn't write. Do you agree, Tom, or do you have an issue with this?
I'm not going to argue the point, but I just hope that someday, far in the future, people are sitting around talking about me the way they talk about Tolkien. Because if they're talking about me, they're buying my books.
Me. They're reading me, yes. So Tolkien's there in his grave going, hey, at least people are buying my books. Thank you. Thank you, John. No, it's... Go ahead.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because yes, Tolkien is considered the template that everyone goes to, but for me, it's not Tolkien I look at when I look at the fantasy genre. I look at Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea books, and those for me are a much better written series with a much better story, with a storyline that's great.
Yeah.
It's actually not as epic as Tolkien stories, and I think for how Tolkien went about setting everything up, the ideas and the stories were great. I mean, his shorter material, like the short stories in the Silmarillion, are much better written than his more epic scale stuff. Even though the short stories have that feel to them.
I'm going to second that.
I think at that point. Yeah. I think at that point, when he went back to write those and the Lost Tales and things like that, I think he had a much better concept of how the stories needed to work in terms of being marketable.
I disagree.
I think that's it.
I will tell you why I disagree. When Tolkien wrote The Hobbit, he was a school teacher, and I think it was Cambridge. But he was grading papers, he got inspired, he flipped over some of the grade papers and he started scribbling. And it was just, hey, I got an idea. So he vomited Hobbit onto the page. It was a very cute little story, it was wonderful. And he showed it to his friend, they published it. His friend said to him, hey, I want a sequel. So his idea of a sequel was The Lord of the Rings. It was 1942, the war was going on, and he hands them a book this thick. And he goes, are you kidding me? There's a war on. We can't afford to print that. So he made Tolkien break it into 3 pieces, which is awesome because if you look at page 1 of The Two Towers, it's actually like page 400 and something. There isn't a page 1 in Two Towers or The War of the Ring, the Return of the King. So they needed to there was a lot of accommodating the people. There was a lot of accommodating the readers, but Silmarillion was not supposed to be published. Silmarillion was written by Tolkien for Tolkien, And that is who he was appeasing. It was all about him. And to me, Hobbit was an author's first book, but Silmarillion was an author's book for the author. And he knew that if he had written Lord of the Rings and Hobbit like he had written Silmarillion, they would not have sold.
So would you consider Silmarillion more of an author's world Bible than a publishable material?
It's not publishable. It's beautiful. Silmarillion, to me, is his masterpiece. People who rave about Lord of the Rings and have not read Silmarillion, you have missed out. To me, Tolkien was his best at Silmarillion. He was a masterful writer with Silmarillion. I don't think he was trying to appease the readers, though. I don't think he was trying to appease a publisher. He was just writing for himself. He put it in a drawer, and when he needed to remember something for Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, he could just reference Silmarillion. That's all it was. And yeah, absolutely. I think it is meant to flesh out the world. That's all he wanted it for. He never in a million years wanted it published, never thought about it. I don't think he could have, which is why he didn't attempt it. He's like, oh, no one wants to know this. So he had it in a drawer. And I just need to state this. Next year, Peter Jackson is currently filming Silmarillion. It's coming out in 7 movies. And next year, he's releasing it. Movie 1. And you are going to see... Oh, I can't wait. I cannot wait. He released The Hobbit, and I went, so when's he going to do the Silmarillion? He released Lord of the Rings, so when's he going to do Silmarillion? And yeah, he's doing Silmarillion. You can Google, look up Sauron the Giver, and you can see what Sauron the Giver looks like before he turned into the eye, why he turned into the eye. Phenomenal. Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I'm very excited. Silmarillion's like my favorite book.
Yeah.
I wouldn't call Tolkien the father of modern fantasy. I've heard people say that, but I disagree with that. What he is to me is the father of world building. He knew how to build a world.
Yeah.
And that is the inspiration I take from him.
Yeah.
I don't try to copy his writing style. I try to copy his detail in building a world.
Yeah. He did such the Hobbits, everything you need to know about Hobbits, his detail right down to, I swear, when you're watching the movie, I can't remember the title. It's like The World According to Hobbits or something like that. And he's laying out exactly what a Hobbit is. I swear they pulled it right out of the books, fresh from the script. And just, you're witnessing Tolkien's words just envelop in front of you. It's so beautiful. Just watching these hobbits, right down to him digging in his ear and pulling out the earwax, him going to kiss a girl, turning around and grabbing a sweet pastry instead. The pipeweed, they think that all we ever think about is food, and that's not true. We also think about booze and smoking. They did such a phenomenal job with it. Such a beautiful job.
What about second breakfast?
What about second breakfast?
So I see Anita sitting there quietly. How do you feel about that, Anita? Should we be holding Tolkien as highly as we do as a master of a genre?
Well, I kind of agree with Tom that he's more of a world builder than the father of fantasy. Yeah, because I mean, I'm not sure if I'd call him the father of modern fantasy, because I mean, there's lots of stuff that came before him as well.
Like what?
Well,
That's
I mean,
very aggressive.
You could make a case for Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, frankly.
Ooh. Oh, see, now to that is not fantasy at all. Oh, not at all. I would call that science fiction. Absolutely, I would call that science fiction, horror, macabre. Sandy?
Yeah, mute. Brothers Grimm.
Oh, yes.
Yes. I wouldn't call that fantasy?
Yeah. Very much fantasy.
Oh, yeah.
All right.
It's the fairy tale genre of fantasy.
All right. Nope. We have a fantasy author. Yeah. Now that's interesting. What if Brothers Grimm? Oh. Just a minute. I got an idea. What if we were to do an anthology? A epic fantasy anthology, retelling the Brothers Grimm's stories as if they were epic fantasies.
Can I torture the evil sisters of Cinderella?
Yeah.
Ooh, can I do one from the villain's point of view?
Yeah. Anything. It has to be. Go ahead.
I kind of did that with my second book in the fantasy series I'm working on, An Enchanting Child, where it isn't all Brothers Grimm, but basically at the beginning, a princess is born.
Yeah.
And like in all fairy stories, 3 fairy godmothers show up to bless the sleeping child, and each fairy comes forward and does their blessing. The first one gives her the beauty and grace. Second one, I think it was intelligence and wisdom. And before the third one could speak, an evil witch appears and says, because I was not invited to this party, I shall curse this child upon her 16th birthday. Hang on, that's the Princess Aurora. This is the Princess Alicia. It is? Or, oops, exit skulk left.
Yeah. No, that would, yeah. Imagine Brothers Grimm, right? Written in the style of Tolkien. We need to do that anthology.
Mine won't be in Tolkien. No.
No, well, example. It was an example.
Yeah.
Definitely bring out the dark fantasy element of Brothers Grimm. Magic systems.
I know a guy that wrote The Tale of Two Cities with dragons.
I know somebody who wrote Pride and Prejudice with zombies. I love that movie. I just got to say.
Also, in that second story, I made a major nod to Sir Terry Pratchett in The Only Way an Author Could. Basically, Fate was thinking to herself about mortals and what is there for mortals when all is said and done.
Right.
Me, comes the voice after her left, bold capital letters, no quotation marks or anything. And she turns to the robed figure holding the sigh and says, I beg your pardon. I said, me. Death says. She does a slow blink and she says, well, you don't belong here. This isn't a Terry Pratchett book. Bugger off.
That's interesting.
Go ahead and mute real quick, Sandy.
You're muted, Tim.
I seem to have a problem with that button. So that leads to an interesting question. Okay, is there anything we shouldn't see in fantasy?
Modern. Anything modern. Technology. If I see any cars. Sorry, I just saw the new Final Fantasy game. Cell phones, cars. Oh, I want to.
Okay.
That's science fantasy.
No, yeah, I
have a point with that. You can have technology if you're doing steampunk fantasy.
That's right. And you can do technology if it's run on the magic system that would make it science fantasy. That's not the case. It is just a car with a gas station, fuel. It is just a cell phone. There's no magic involved, but it's Final Fantasy.
Urban fantasy?
Urban fantasy is fine. But if you say fantasy to me, like Final Fantasy, and I see them driving around in cars like they were and talking on their cell phones, you can take selfies. You can take selfies. His ringtone is, and I'm just like, okay, that was cool. But seriously? Oh, piss me off. Yeah.
If if you look at the history behind the Final Fantasy stories, though, it has always been a science fantasy setup. It's never been anything else.
Yes, and I have seen the other science fantasy, or the Final Fantasies, and those were fine. I don't mind the tech. I don't mind that modern steampunk look. I had a problem with them driving around in your basic standard sedan or Corvette. I'm sorry, not a Corvette. I can't think of what it's called. I had a problem with them just sitting there chatting on their cell phone and taking selfies. It yanked me so fast out of the fantasy of it. It stopped being fantasy and started being realistic, and I couldn't buy it. It was just not credible to me anymore. If the car ran on magic, okay. If the car looked like it was from that culture instead of 1975, okay.
Like them choppers in World of Warcraft. They run on steam.
Yeah, steam would have, okay, yeah, all right, I'd forgive them. If they ran on steam, okay.
Yeah, you got to add some time travel to that fantasy.
Yeah, that would make sense. That I'd be okay with. Yeah, I think that's it, as long as it's logical and makes sense. Unlike Narnia. Santa Claus. I had better not be seeing Santa Claus in a world where Christianity, Santa Claus, and Norse myth does not exist. That was, I had a really hard time. If they were on Earth and Santa Claus showed up for Christmas, okay, fine. But they were in Narnia, where Christianity, Norse mythology, and Coca-Cola don't exist. And suddenly there's this guy, and I'm like, what are you doing here? Did you go through the portal too, like 10,000 years ago? That really, really bothered me. So I better not see Santa Claus.
So no cars, no cell phones, no Santa Claus. Okay,
that's
Anita,
right.
Your list of banned elements within fantasy.
I'm not sure I have any, really. I mean, as long as it fits the story. Like with what Angela said, if it seems out of place, then no.
Say Santa Claus.
What? I've seen some good fantasy stories with Santa Claus.
But was Santa Claus supposed to be there?
With Bruce Campbell and Santa Claus, that was good.
No, you said Bruce Campbell. That was logical.
Well, Bruce Campbell in anything makes it better. Really. I'll watch anything with Bruce Campbell with it.
I'm going to throw across the river to Sandy.
We did have Santa Claus show up in Doctor Who.
It was logical. Time travel. It was logical.
It was all in their heads.
That's fine. Narnia didn't make sense. I really hate Narnia. I hate C.S. Lewis. What moron shows up and gives weapons to children who miraculously know how to use them? I have fired a bow. It is not easy. These kids she's 10 and she's like, perfect.
Magical weapons. Has anyone seen the cartoons?
Oh, well, honey, we got that lovely echo. You're in both cameras. Sandy picked you up.
Dungeons and Dragons cartoons.
We own them. Cartoons. Oh God,
hand these kids weapons. They can use them. They're magical weapons. That's all you need to know.
I just held up my hand and went, I own those. We have them on DVD downstairs.
Tom, go ahead and give us your absolutely can't have in fantasies.
Right now in my head is Thundercats. I agree with Anita. I mean, anything can be possible if it fits. But if it doesn't fit and it's out of place, it simply drives the reader away from the story. Now, I like Narnia, so leave that alone.
But there was Santa Claus. What is Santa Claus doing in Narnia?
He was a fantasy Santa Claus.
No, he was. And what moron gives weapons to children? I would beat the crap out of him if she
fantasy Santa Claus.
Dungeon Master.
There you go.
He was a dungeon master.
The dungeon master can do anything.
He was a dungeon master. Oh, he was a bad dungeon master, but that makes sense. Boy.
That makes me think. I used to be a dungeon master, actually.
Okay, let's just simplify that. Wait. Whoa, Tom. Let's simplify that. Who has not been a dungeon master here?
Well,
I haven't.
Okay.
Well, the thing was, whenever the players would say, "You can't do that. How could you do that?"
I'm the dungeon master.
My response was, "It's in the script."
I love that.
The Dungeons and Dragons cartoon. He wasn't a bad dungeon master. It was just his first campaign.
That's great. That's nice. My line when I was the dungeon master and I was challenged by the players, I am the dungeon master. I was power driven a little bit.
My DM screen had three words on the front. I am God.
Beautiful. You know what I don't understand is when I meet a writer who has never played Dungeons and Dragons. I'm just like, Dungeons and Dragons was written for authors. Like, it is the author tabletop game. And it has nothing to do with fantasy, ironically.
Go read my bio.
Does anyone have a game going on right now? I have a campaign. Does anyone else have a game going?
So I think we've actually come to a point where we're kind of drifting way, way, way off topic at this point. I think we're going to wrap up at this point and say thank you to everyone for coming along and go around the room and give everyone a chance to say hi, or goodbye in this case, and find out where people can locate you online. Let's start with Tom.
Okay, I will say goodbye. You can find me at tomfallwell.com and find links to everything else that you can find me at there. So it's real simple. That's 4 Elves. I'm related to Jerry, but he's not in the immediate family. He's only got 3 Elves, so it's Tom Fallwell.
Anita, go ahead.
Yeah, well, I'll say goodbye, and I had lots of fun. And you can find me on my website, Welcome to Avalon, on Twitter at Scribe77, and I have a group on Facebook, AF Stewart's Minions, where I spend most of my time. Oh, and I'm
it's
on
an
Instagram.
Awesome group. I recommend people dropping in.
Yeah, I'm also on Instagram too.
Dropping in on that. Go ahead.
Goodbye from Sandi Bateson. I will be having my first 2 short stories put in Book Dreams, and that's where you'll be able to find me now. Bye for me.
And I'm Angela B. Chrysler. This post is going to be at the B2BCyCon.com website under panel discussions and also under fantasy. Also, you will be located underneath the panel discussion will be all of these links that everyone here has given, so you'll be able to find us easily.
And I've been your host and sometime coordinator for all of this, Timothy Bateson, fantasy genre manager for the B2BCyCon 2018. I can be found at Timothy Bateson, author.weebly.com, or timothybateson.author.wordpress.com for my blog. I'm all over Facebook. I'm all over Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I'm on Pinterest. Just go ahead and search for me and you'll find me there. I've been writing urban fantasy and science fiction. And on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much to Angela for bringing everyone together. And go ahead and Angela, if you wouldn't mind saying goodbye to everyone again, and we'll shut down.
All right. Thank you very much, and happy CyConing.